In the mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispers through the wind and every shadow could hide an enemy, Navy SEALs learned to trust their instincts above all else. But on this particular mission, their instincts screamed danger from every direction. 7 enemy snipers had turned their extraction point into a killing field, and the elite warriors found themselves trapped like sitting ducks. What happened next would become legend in special operations circles, not because of superior American firepower or advanced technology, but because of a figure that seemed to emerge from the very stones of the mountain itself. A ghost in black fabric who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. The SEALs had no idea they were about to witness one of the most extraordinary displays of marksmanship and tactical brilliance in modern warfare. They had no idea that their salvation would come from the last person they expected, and they certainly had no idea that the mysterious figure watching over them would disappear as quietly as she had appeared, leaving behind only questions and the bodies of 7 enemy snipers who never saw death coming. This is the story of Amina Kottak, a name the SEALs would never learn, a face they would never clearly see, and a debt they could never repay. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison crouched behind a boulder, his breath forming small clouds in the thin mountain air. The radio crackled softly against his ear as his team leader's voice cut through the static. Overwatch reports 7 confirmed enemy snipers in elevated positions. They've got us pinned down good, boys. Morrison closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of command settle on his shoulders like the heavy pack he carried. His 4-man SEAL team had been conducting reconnaissance on a high-value target when everything went sideways. What should have been a simple observation mission had turned into a nightmare when Taliban forces discovered their position and set up a deadly trap. The mountains of the Hindu Kush stretched endlessly around them, their peaks touching clouds that seemed close enough to grab. These ancient rocks had witnessed countless battles over the centuries, and now they would witness another. The terrain was both beautiful and terrifying. Massive stone formations that could hide an army, valleys that echoed with the crack of rifle fire, and ridges that offered perfect sniper nests for anyone patient enough to use them. Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez crawled up beside Morrison, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. "Sir, we've got movement on the North Ridge. That makes 8 confirmed positions now." His voice was steady, but Morrison could hear the underlying tension. They were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in what the military called a target-rich environment, except they were the targets. Morrison pulled out his binoculars and scanned the surrounding ridges. The enemy had positioned themselves expertly, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible escape route. These weren't amateur fighters. They moved with the patience and precision of experienced mountain warriors who knew every rock and crevice of this terrain. The mission had started 12 hours earlier at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Intelligence reports suggested that a high-ranking Taliban commander was using a compound in this valley as a safe house. Morrison's team had been tasked with confirming his presence and gathering intelligence on his security arrangements. It was supposed to be routine surveillance: get in, observe, report, and get out. They had infiltrated under cover of darkness, moving like ghosts through the mountain passes. The team consisted of Morrison, Rodriguez, Petty Officer Second Class Thompson, and Hospital Corpsman Second Class Williams. Each man was a veteran of multiple deployments, hardened by years of combat in some of the world's most dangerous places. The observation post they had chosen offered an excellent view of the target compound, but it also left them exposed on 3 sides. Morrison had made the decision based on the intelligence available at the time, intelligence that had apparently been wrong about enemy force strength in the area. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and pink, the team had settled into their hide site and begun their surveillance. The compound below showed signs of activity, with several vehicles and armed guards visible. Morrison was documenting everything when Thompson spotted the first sniper. "Movement on the eastern ridge," Thompson had whispered into his radio. "Looks like a sniper position being established." Within minutes, they had spotted 2 more positions. Then 3. By the time the sun was fully up, they had counted 7 different sniper nests, all positioned to cover their location. The Taliban had known they were coming. Now, 6 hours later, they remained trapped. Every time one of them moved, rifle fire erupted from multiple directions. The enemy snipers were patient, disciplined, and deadly accurate. They had turned the SEALs' observation post into a killing ground. Morrison studied the tactical situation. The enemy positions were well concealed and expertly placed. The snipers had the high ground, superior numbers, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Calling in air support was impossible. The mountain peaks interfered with radio communications, and the narrow valley made close air support extremely risky. Williams crawled over to join them, his medical pack dragging behind him. "Sir, we're running low on water, and the temperature's dropping. If we're still here when the sun goes down, hypothermia becomes a real concern." Morrison nodded grimly. Night in the mountains could be brutal, with temperatures plummeting well below freezing. Their summer weight gear wouldn't provide adequate protection for an extended stay. They needed to move, but movement meant exposing themselves to deadly accurate rifle fire. Rodriguez was studying the ridge lines through his scope when he suddenly froze. "Wait a minute," he whispered. "There's something moving on the western slope. It's not one of the known sniper positions." Morrison swung his binoculars in that direction. At first, he saw nothing but rocks and sparse vegetation. Then, like a mirage forming in the desert, a figure seemed to materialize from the mountainside itself. Draped in dark fabric that seemed to blend with the shadows, the figure moved with fluid grace across terrain that would challenge even the most experienced climber. "What the hell is that?" Thompson muttered, pressing his eye to his rifle scope. The figure appeared to be moving toward one of the enemy sniper positions, using the natural contours of the mountain to remain hidden from view. Morrison watched in fascination as the mysterious form navigated obstacles that should have been impossible to cross silently. "Could be a local," Williams suggested. "Maybe someone trying to get away from the fighting." But Morrison wasn't convinced. The figure moved with too much purpose, too much tactical awareness. This wasn't someone fleeing the battle. This was someone joining it. As they watched, the figure disappeared behind a rocky outcropping near the northernmost sniper position. For several minutes, nothing happened. The enemy snipers continued their patient watch, occasionally firing at shadows or movement that might have been one of the SEALs. Then, without warning, the firing from the northern position stopped. Morrison waited, counting seconds. Sniper positions didn't just go silent without reason. Either the sniper had been eliminated, or he was repositioning for a better shot. Given the tactical discipline they had observed all day, repositioning seemed unlikely. "Northern position has gone quiet," Rodriguez reported what they were all thinking. 3,000 meters away, Amina Kotak pressed her body against the cold stone and controlled her breathing. The ancient rifle in her hands had belonged to her father, and, before that, her grandfather. 3 generations of her family had used this weapon to defend their mountain homeland from invaders. First the Soviets, then various warlords, and now the Taliban. She had been tracking the enemy snipers since before dawn, moving through terrain she had known since childhood. These mountains were not just her home, they were part of her soul. Every ridge, every hidden path, every cave that could provide shelter was mapped in her memory with the precision of a military cartographer. The Taliban fighters below thought they were masters of mountain warfare, but they were outsiders here. They came from the plains and the cities, bringing their foreign ideas and their brutal interpretation of Islam. To them, these peaks were simply high ground to be conquered. To Amina, they were sacred. She had watched the American soldiers establish their observation post during the night. Their movement was skilled, but they had chosen a location that local fighters would never select. It offered excellent views of the valley, but left them exposed to attack from multiple directions. She had shaken her head in the darkness, understanding that they would be discovered once the sun rose. The decision to help them had not come easily. Americans were also invaders, also foreigners who brought violence to her land. But she had listened to the radio communications between the Taliban snipers, and she understood their intentions. They planned to torture the captured Americans before executing them, recording everything to spread fear among coalition forces. Amina had seen enough torture and death. Her village had been attacked 3 times by Taliban forces seeking to establish control over the mountain passes. They had killed her uncle for teaching girls to read, and They had destroyed the small school where she had once learned to write her name in English. The Americans might be invaders, but the Taliban were something worse. They were destroyers of everything she valued. The first sniper position had been surprisingly easy to approach. The fighter was young, maybe 18 years old, and he kept shifting his position to get more comfortable. He had no idea that comfort was the enemy of survival in the mountains. Amina had been able to crawl within arm's reach before he even sensed her presence. The knife had been quick and silent. Her father had taught her that mercy in killing was a gift. Make it fast, make it clean, and take no pleasure in it. The young Taliban fighter had died instantly, never knowing what had happened to him. Now she was approaching the second position, where an older fighter had established himself behind a natural rock blind. This one was more experienced. He kept his rifle trained on the Americans below, while occasionally scanning his surroundings. His discipline was better, his awareness sharper. Amina studied his position for several minutes, noting his patterns. Every 43 seconds, he would shift his attention from his rifle scope to check his flanks. During those brief moments, he would look left first, then right, then return to his scope. The pattern was consistent enough to be exploited. She waited for the next cycle, then moved during his left side scan. 5 steps brought her to a position directly behind him. As he began his right side scan, she rose from cover and struck. This fighter sensed her presence at the last moment, but it was too late. The knife found the gap between his ribs and pierced his heart before he could cry out. 2 down, 5 remaining. Amina retreated to cover and studied the remaining positions. The third sniper was the most dangerous, an experienced fighter who had positioned himself perfectly and maintained excellent discipline. He would be the hardest to approach without being detected. As she planned her route to the third position, Amina thought about the strange path that had brought her to this moment. Born in a village so remote it appeared on no maps, she had learned to hunt before she could properly walk. Her father had treated her like the son he never had, teaching her skills that most mountain women never learned. When the Soviets invaded, she had been too young to fight, but old enough to carry messages between resistance groups. The mountain passes that challenged trained soldiers were like highways to her young feet. She had memorized routes that could move fighters and supplies without detection, becoming a vital link in the network that eventually drove the invaders away. After the Soviets left, warlords had filled the vacuum, fighting endless battles for control of territory that couldn't be controlled. Amina had watched armies rise and fall, seen commanders who thought they understood mountain warfare die in avalanches or ambushes. The mountains always won in the end. When the Americans arrived after the September 11th attacks, she had initially stayed neutral. Their war was not her war, and their enemies were not necessarily her enemies. But as the Taliban grew stronger and more oppressive, she found herself increasingly opposed to their extremist ideology. The turning point had come when Taliban fighters executed her cousin for the crime of singing while working in her garden. They had claimed that women's voices were forbidden, that singing was against Islamic law. Amina knew enough about Islam to understand this was not religion, but control, an attempt to break the spirit of mountain women who had always been strong and independent. Now, as she moved toward the third sniper position, Amina carried the weight of all those losses. Each step was taken for her executed cousin, her murdered uncle, and all the children who would never learn to read because the Taliban had burned their school. The third sniper had chosen his position well. He was lodged in a crevice between 2 large boulders, with excellent fields of fire and protection from multiple directions. Approaching him directly would be impossible. He would see her coming long before she could get close enough to strike. But Amina knew these mountains in ways that no textbook could teach. Behind his position, hidden from view, was a narrow chimney in the rock that connected to a cave system she had explored as a child. The cave had multiple entrances, including one that would put her directly above the sniper's position. The climb was treacherous, requiring her to navigate loose rock and narrow passages in complete silence. One displaced stone would alert every enemy fighter in the area. But Amina had been climbing these rocks since childhood, and her hands and feet found holds that seemed impossible to others. The cave system was exactly as she remembered it, a network of passages carved by millions of years of wind and water. She moved through the darkness by touch and memory, counting steps and feeling for landmarks that would guide her to the correct exit. When she emerged from the rock chimney above the sniper's position, she found herself looking down at the top of his head. He was completely focused on the Americans below, occasionally speaking into his radio in the crude dialect that marked him as an outsider to these mountains. Amina drew her knife and prepared to strike, but something made her pause. This fighter was different from the others. His equipment was better, his position more professional. The way he held his rifle and controlled his breathing suggested extensive training. She studied him more carefully and noticed the small radio headset he wore. Unlike the others, who communicated occasionally with their commander, this one seemed to be in constant communication with someone. His role wasn't just to kill the Americans. He was coordinating the entire operation. Lieutenant Commander Morrison pressed his back against the boulder and tried to make sense of what was happening around them. 3 sniper positions had gone silent in the past hour, and the remaining enemy fighters were clearly becoming agitated. Their radio chatter had increased dramatically, though he couldn't understand the rapid-fire Pashto being transmitted between positions. "Sir, this is getting weird," Rodriguez whispered, adjusting his position to get a better view of the ridge lines. "Professional snipers don't just abandon their posts. Something's taking them out, but I haven't heard a single gunshot." Morrison had reached the same conclusion. In his 12 years as a Navy SEAL, he had never witnessed anything like this. Enemy forces didn't simply disappear without trace, especially not disciplined fighters who had demonstrated the tactical patience to maintain an ambush for hours. Thompson crawled over to join them, his rifle ready. "Movement on the eastern slope, sir. Looks like one of the remaining snipers is repositioning." He seemed spooked. Through his binoculars, Morrison watched a figure in traditional Afghan clothing moving carefully along a rocky ledge. The fighter kept looking over his shoulder, scanning areas where his fallen comrades should have been providing overwatch. His body language suggested fear and confusion rather than tactical confidence. "Whatever's happening up there, it's working in our favor," Williams observed. "But we still can't move. 4 snipers can kill us just as dead as 7. Morrison knew he was right. Despite the mysterious elimination of 3 enemy positions, they remained trapped. The surviving snipers had adjusted their fields of fire to compensate for their losses, and any attempt to leave their rocky shelter would still result in immediate death. But something else was happening that gave him hope. The enemy's communication discipline had broken down completely. Instead of the professional, measured radio traffic they had monitored earlier, the remaining fighters were chattering constantly, their voices revealing panic and uncertainty. Meanwhile, 2,000 meters away, Amina faced her greatest challenge yet. The 4th sniper had chosen a position that seemed impossible to approach undetected. He had established himself on a narrow ledge halfway up a sheer rock face, with perfect views of the Americans below and excellent protection from attack. The position was tactically brilliant, but also psychologically telling. This fighter had chosen safety over optimal shooting angles, suggesting he was more concerned about his own survival than mission accomplishment. Fear was making him cautious, and caution could be exploited. Amina studied the rock face through her binoculars, tracing possible climbing routes to the sniper's perch. The most direct path would require her to traverse an exposed section where she would be visible to the other enemy positions. But there was another route, a dangerous chimney climb that would take her up the backside of the formation, hidden from view, but requiring technical climbing skills that few possessed. She had climbed this particular face as a teenager, proving to her father that she could navigate terrain that challenged even the most experienced mountain fighters. The route was carved into her muscle memory, but 20 years had passed since her last attempt. Her body was older now, less flexible, and the margin for error was non-existent. The climb began in a narrow crack barely wide enough for her shoulders. Amina wedged herself into the stone chimney and began working her way upward, using opposing pressure between her back and feet to maintain position. Every movement had to be controlled and silent. Any sound would alert the sniper above. 50 feet up the crack, she encountered the crux of the climb. The chimney narrowed to a gap barely 8 inches wide, requiring her to exhale completely to squeeze through. On the other side, the crack widened again, but There was a 10-foot section with no handholds where she would need to rely entirely on the opposition technique. Amina paused to control her breathing and focus her mind. Her father had taught her that fear was like cold. Acknowledge it, respect it, but don't let it control your actions. The sniper above represented everything she opposed about the Taliban presence in her mountains. He was an obstacle to peace, a threat to the innocent, and a symbol of foreign oppression. She squeezed through the narrow section and began the most technical part of the climb. With her back pressed against one wall and her feet against the other, she worked her way upward inch by inch. The ancient stone was cold and rough, providing just enough friction to make the technique possible. As she climbed, Amina could hear the sniper above talking into his radio. His voice was tense, asking repeatedly for status reports from positions that would never respond. He was beginning to understand that his carefully planned ambush was falling apart, but he couldn't comprehend how or why. The exit from the chimney brought her onto a ledge directly above the sniper's position. She was now close enough to hear him breathing, close enough to see the nervous way he shifted his rifle from target to target. This fighter was young like the first one she had eliminated, but his fear made him more dangerous than his age suggested. Amina drew her knife and prepared to drop onto the ledge behind him. But as she positioned herself for the final strike, loose rocks shifted under her weight. A single pebble broke free and bounced off the sniper's shoulder. The fighter spun around with reflexes honed by months of combat, his rifle swinging toward her position. For a frozen moment, their eyes met across the narrow ledge. Amina saw recognition dawn in his face, not of her specifically, but of what she represented. The mysterious force that had been eliminating his comrades had a face. The sniper tried to bring his rifle to bear, but the confined space worked against him. The barrel caught on the rock wall, giving Amina the precious seconds she needed to close the distance. She moved with the fluid grace of someone born to these mountains, covering the gap between them faster than thought. The knife found its mark before he could cry out a warning to his remaining comrades. But the damage had been done. His finger had tightened on the trigger as he died, sending a wild shot echoing across the valley. The gunshot shattered the tense silence that had prevailed for the past hour. Immediately, radio traffic exploded as the three remaining snipers demanded to know what had happened. When their fourth colleague failed to respond, panic began to set in. Amina quickly searched the dead fighter's equipment. His radio was more sophisticated than the others, suggesting he might have been a commander or specialist. More importantly, she found detailed maps of the area with all 7 sniper positions clearly marked. Studying the enemy's tactical plan, she could see the deadly brilliance of their setup. Each position had been chosen to provide overlapping fields of fire while remaining hidden from the others. The snipers couldn't see each other, which meant they couldn't visually confirm what was happening to their comrades. But the maps also revealed something else: the locations of the 3 remaining fighters. Armed with this intelligence, Amina could plan her approach to each position with deadly precision. Below in the valley, Morrison and his team heard the rifle shot and immediately went to maximum alert. Williams raised his rifle and scanned the ridges, looking for any sign of movement or muzzle flash. Single shot, Thompson reported. Came from the eastern slope, but I can't identify the source. Morrison was studying the ridge lines when something caught his attention. A figure in dark clothing was moving along a ledge that seemed impossible to traverse. The mysterious person appeared to be heading toward another known sniper position with purpose and confidence. Rodriguez, you seeing this? Morrison whispered. Roger that, sir. Our guardian angel is still working. The 5th sniper was different from the others. Amina could sense it as she studied his position through her binoculars. While his fallen comrades had been nervous, shifting constantly, and breaking discipline, this one remained perfectly still. His position was expertly chosen, his fieldcraft exceptional, and his patience suggested extensive combat experience. He had established himself in a natural depression among the rocks, with carefully constructed camouflage that made him nearly invisible even when she knew where to look. Unlike the younger fighters, this one hadn't panicked when his comrades stopped responding to radio calls. Instead, he had adjusted his position to cover their abandoned sectors while maintaining watch on his primary target area. Amina recognized the type, a professional soldier, possibly a former military officer who had joined the Taliban for reasons of conviction rather than desperation. These men were the most dangerous enemies because they combined tactical skill with unwavering determination. They couldn't be rattled, couldn't be rushed into mistakes, and rarely left openings that could be exploited. She spent 30 minutes studying his position, looking for any weakness in his setup. The depression he occupied was accessed by a single narrow approach that he would certainly be watching. The surrounding terrain offered no concealment for anyone trying to get close. He had chosen perfectly, creating a mini-fortress that seemed impregnable. But Amina had advantages that her adversary couldn't account for. She knew these mountains in ways that no outsider could match, and she understood that the most obvious approach was never the only approach. The land itself was her ally, and it offered secrets that couldn't be learned from maps or tactical manuals. Directly below the sniper's position, hidden by the angle of the slope, was the entrance to a cave system that connected to the depression where he waited. Local children had used these caves for generations, playing hide-and-seek games that had inadvertently taught them every passage and connection in the mountain. The cave entrance was concealed behind a curtain of hanging vegetation, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Amina approached it carefully, mindful that even the slightest sound would carry through the rock to alert her target above. Inside the cave, absolute darkness enveloped her. She moved by touch and memory, feeling her way along passages that had been carved by underground streams over countless millennia. The air was cold and still, carrying the mineral scent of deep stone and the faint dampness of water that had seeped through rock for ages. 20 meters into the cave system, she found the passage she remembered, a narrow tunnel that angled sharply upward toward the surface. As a child, she had emerged from this tunnel to surprise playmates who thought she had disappeared completely. Today, she would use the same route to surprise a professional killer. The tunnel was barely wide enough for her shoulders, and the climb was treacherous in complete darkness. Loose stones threatened to give way under her weight, and she had to test each handhold carefully before trusting it with her life. One wrong move would send her tumbling back into the depths, possibly alerting the sniper with the sound of her fall. As she climbed, Amina thought about the choices that had led her to this moment. She could have remained hidden in her village, avoiding the conflict that raged across her homeland. Many mountain people had chosen that path, keeping their heads down and hoping that armies would pass them by without notice. But Amina had seen too much suffering to remain neutral. She had watched the Taliban execute teachers, destroy schools, and terrorize women for the crime of seeking education. She had seen them burn ancient manuscripts that contained centuries of local history and culture. They claimed to fight for Islam, but their actions revealed a hatred of everything that made her people unique. The Americans were also foreigners, also invaders who brought violence to her land. But they had never burned schools or executed teachers. Their war was against those who had attacked their homeland. And while Amina might not agree with all their methods, she could understand their motivation for fighting. More importantly, the Taliban fighters who had trapped these Americans represented the same extremist ideology that threatened her own people. By eliminating them, she struck a blow for the independence and freedom that her ancestors had fought to preserve for generations. The tunnel began to level out, indicating that she was approaching the surface. Ahead, she could see the faintest hint of light filtering through what must be the exit. The opening was concealed behind a large boulder that had fallen in exactly the right position to hide the cave entrance from casual observation. Amina paused to listen for any sound from above. The sniper's position should be directly overhead, but the thickness of the rock muffled any noise he might be making. She would need to emerge from the tunnel and locate him before he became aware of her presence. The cave exit brought her onto a small ledge directly behind the sniper's depression. She was now less than 10 meters from her target, but the final approach would be the most dangerous. Unlike the other positions she had attacked, this one offered no concealment for the last few steps. Through a gap in the rocks, she could see the sniper's profile. He was older than the others, maybe 40 years old, with the weathered features of someone who had spent years in harsh conditions. His rifle was a precision instrument, well-maintained and equipped with high-quality optics. Everything about his setup suggested professional military training. As she watched, he spoke quietly into his radio, reporting that he maintained eyes on target and requesting instructions from his commander. His voice was calm and controlled, showing no signs of the panic that had infected the younger fighters. He was a professional doing his job, regardless of circumstances. Amina drew her knife and began the final approach. Unlike her previous attacks, this one would need to be perfectly executed. The sniper's experience and positioning meant that any mistake would be fatal for her and potentially for the trapped Americans below. She moved one careful step at a time, testing each footfall before committing her weight. The loose stones that covered these slopes could betray her with the slightest careless movement. Every muscle in her body was coiled for instant action, ready to strike if the opportunity presented itself. 5 meters from the sniper's position, disaster struck. A rock that had seemed solidly placed shifted under her foot, sending a cascade of smaller stones tumbling down the slope. The sound was like thunder in the mountain silence. The sniper spun toward her with the reflexes of a seasoned combat veteran, his rifle swinging around faster than seemed possible. But his quick movement caused him to lose his balanced position in the depression, and the barrel of his rifle caught on the rocks he had used for concealment. The momentary delay gave Amina the opening she needed. She launched herself across the remaining distance, her knife extended in a killing thrust. The sniper tried to bring his rifle to bear while rolling away from her attack, but the confined space worked against him. They collided in a tangle of limbs and weapons, rolling across the rocky depression in a life-or-death struggle. The sniper was stronger and heavier, but Amina had the advantage of surprise and the desperate strength that came from fighting for survival. The knife found its mark, but not before the sniper managed to squeeze off a shot that echoed across the valley like a thunderclap. Unlike the accidental discharge from the previous position, this shot had been aimed. Through the scope of his rifle, he had seen one of the American soldiers moving between cover. Below in the valley, Thompson suddenly stumbled and fell behind his boulder. "I'm hit," he called out, his voice tight with pain. Took one in the shoulder. Williams immediately began moving toward his wounded teammate, keeping low and using available cover. "How bad is it?" "Went clean through," Thompson replied through gritted teeth. "I can still fight, but I'm bleeding pretty good." Morrison felt his tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. They were down to 2 effective fighters, still had 2 enemy snipers in unknown positions, and now they had a wounded man who might need immediate medical attention. But as he watched the ridge lines for signs of the remaining enemy positions, Morrison noticed something encouraging. The radio chatter that had been constant throughout the day had suddenly gone quiet. Either the enemy snipers were repositioning for a final assault, or their mysterious protector had continued her deadly work. High above them, Amina stood over the body of the 5th sniper and tried to assess the tactical situation. The shot he had fired before dying had clearly hit one of the Americans, though she couldn't tell how seriously. Time was running out. The remaining 2 snipers would now know that something extraordinary was happening, and they would adjust their tactics accordingly. But she had eliminated 5 of the 7 positions, dramatically improving the Americans' chances of survival. More importantly, she had disrupted the enemy's coordination and communication, forcing them to operate independently rather than as a coordinated unit. 2 snipers remained between the trapped soldiers, and the last 2 Taliban snipers had reached the same conclusion simultaneously. They were being hunted by something that defied explanation. Mohammad Yusuf, positioned on the southern ridge, was a veteran of the Soviet occupation who had survived more battles than he could count. His companion, Rashid Khan, held the northern position and had earned his reputation fighting American forces across 3 provinces. Both men understood that their carefully planned ambush had become a nightmare. 5 of their comrades had been eliminated without a trace, picked off by an adversary who moved like smoke and struck without warning. Now they faced a choice that would define the remainder of their lives: flee and live, or stay and likely die. Yusuf made his decision first. Speaking quietly into his radio, he informed Khan that he was abandoning his position. "This is not war," he said in rapid Pashto. "This is something else. Something unnatural." Khan's response crackled back immediately. "You are a coward. These are just Americans with advanced technology. We stay and finish the mission. But Yusuf had seen enough supernatural events in these mountains to recognize when he was facing forces beyond human understanding. During the Soviet War, he had witnessed things that couldn't be explained by military doctrine. Entire patrols that vanished without trace, vehicles found empty with no signs of struggle, weapons that jammed at crucial moments as if the mountains themselves opposed the invaders. He began gathering his equipment, moving carefully but quickly. The longer he remained in position, the greater his chances of joining his 5 dead comrades. Survival trumped mission completion, and his survival instincts were screaming warnings that couldn't be ignored. From her new position with the captured rifle, Amina watched Yusuf's withdrawal through the precision scope. Part of her wanted to let him go. One less enemy to eliminate, one less life to take. But she couldn't risk him regrouping with Taliban forces and returning with reinforcements. The Americans below needed time to extract their wounded comrade and reach safety. The shot was technically challenging, requiring her to compensate for wind, elevation, and the movement of her target across broken terrain. Amina had never used a precision rifle before, having learned marksmanship with her father's ancient hunting rifle that required much closer ranges. But the scope revealed details that would have been invisible to the naked eye. She could see Yusuf's face clearly, could read the fear and desperation in his expression. He was a man who understood that death was stalking him through these peaks, and he was running for his life. Amina centered the crosshairs on his chest and slowly squeezed the trigger, exactly as her father had taught her decades ago with their old rifle. The weapon fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding peaks, and Yusuf collapsed instantly, his equipment scattering across the rocky slope. The shot immediately drew return fire from Khan's position. Bullets sparked off the rocks around Amina's location as the surviving sniper tried to locate and eliminate the threat that had devastated his unit. His shooting was accurate and disciplined, forcing her to take cover behind the boulder that had concealed her approach. Khan's position was the strongest of all the sniper nests, a natural fortress of stone that offered excellent protection and multiple fields of fire. Unlike his fallen comrades, he had backup positions prepared and knew exactly how to use the terrain to his advantage. Eliminating him would require different tactics. As bullets continued to impact around her position, Amina studied the tactical situation. Khan was approximately 400 meters away, positioned behind rocks that made a direct assault impossible. His rifle had superior range and accuracy compared to her captured weapon, and his experience gave him significant advantages in a long-range duel. But Amina had one crucial advantage that her adversary couldn't match. She knew every inch of these mountains, including routes that no outsider would ever discover. Behind Khan's position, accessible only by a treacherous climb up a near-vertical rock face, was a hidden path that would bring her within striking distance. The climb would be the most dangerous thing she had ever attempted. The rock face was nearly smooth, with handholds that required exceptional strength and technique to use effectively. One slip would send her tumbling hundreds of feet to her death. But it was the only approach that wouldn't expose her to Khan's rifle fire. Amina slung the captured rifle across her back and began the ascent. The first 50 feet were the most difficult, requiring her to find tiny cracks in the stone where she could wedge her fingers and toes. The rock was cold and sharp, cutting her hands as she worked her way upward. Halfway up the face, she encountered a section where the rock overhung slightly, forcing her to climb while hanging partially upside down. Her shoulder muscles burned with the strain, and her grip began to weaken from fatigue and blood loss from the cuts on her hands. Below her, Khan continued to fire sporadically at the position where she had last been seen, unaware that his target was now climbing directly toward him. His shots echoed across the valley, each one a reminder of what would happen if he discovered her approach before she could get close enough to strike. As she climbed higher, Amina thought about her village and the people she was fighting to protect. Children who deserved the chance to learn and grow without fear. Women who should be free to sing while they worked in their gardens. Elders who carried the wisdom of generations and whose stories should be preserved, not silenced by extremist ideology. The Taliban represented everything that threatened the traditional way of life in these mountains. They brought foreign interpretations of religion that had nothing to do with the tolerant Islam practiced by her people. They imposed rules that made no sense in a land where women had always been partners in survival rather than property to be controlled. Fighting them wasn't just about protecting the Americans below. It was about preserving a way of life that had existed in these peaks for centuries. Every bullet Khan fired was an assault on the freedom and dignity that her ancestors had died to defend. The final section of the climb brought her onto a narrow ledge directly above Khan's position. She could hear him below, speaking into his radio and calling for reinforcements that would never arrive. His voice carried confidence and determination, but also the underlying tension of a man who knew he was facing something beyond his understanding. Amina unslung the rifle and checked its condition. The climb had been hard on the weapon, and she needed to ensure it was still functional. The scope had suffered some damage from contact with the rocks, but the rifle itself seemed intact. She positioned herself at the edge of the ledge and looked down at Khan's position. He was well concealed among the rocks, but from her elevated angle, she could see portions of his body that would be invisible from ground level. It was a difficult shot, steep angle, moving target, damaged scope, but it was her best chance to end this confrontation. As she prepared to fire, Khan suddenly shifted position, rising slightly to get a better view of the area where Amina had last been seen. The movement exposed his head and shoulders, presenting the target she needed. The shot was perfect. Khan collapsed instantly, his rifle clattering against the rocks as his lifeless hands released their grip. The sound echoed across the valley, followed by an absolute silence that seemed to stretch forever. 7 enemy snipers had been eliminated. The ambush that should have killed 4 American Special Operations soldiers was over. Below in the valley, Morrison and his team waited in tense silence for several minutes before accepting that the shooting had stopped. No more bullets whined overhead. No more radio chatter crackled from the ridges. The threat that had pinned them down for hours had been neutralized by their mysterious protector. "I think it's over," Williams whispered, his medical kit still pressed against Thompson's wounded shoulder. Morrison stood slowly, expecting at any moment to hear the crack of a rifle and feel the impact of a bullet. When nothing happened, he began to believe that they might actually survive this nightmare. He raised his binoculars and scanned the ridge lines, looking for any sign of the figure who had saved their lives. For several minutes, he saw nothing but rocks and shadows. Then, just for an instant, he caught a glimpse of dark fabric moving across a distant slope. The figure paused at the crest of a ridge, silhouetted against the sky for just a moment. Morrison thought he saw her turn toward their position, though the distance made it impossible to be certain. Then, she was gone, disappearing into the vast landscape as mysteriously as she had appeared. "Did you see her?" Rodriguez asked. Morrison lowered his binoculars and nodded. "Guardian angel," he said quietly. They would never learn her name or understand her motivations completely. They would never be able to thank her properly or repay the debt they owed. But they would never forget that somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, a woman in black fabric had risked everything to save the lives of 4 strangers. As they began their extraction, moving carefully down the valley toward their pickup point, Morrison thought about the battle they had just witnessed. 7 professional snipers had been eliminated by someone who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. Someone who knew these mountains better than the wind itself and fought with a courage that defied explanation. The war in Afghanistan would continue for years, with battles fought by armies and air forces, drones, and missiles. But today, in a remote valley that appeared on no strategic maps, the most important victory had been won by a single warrior who asked for nothing in return except the freedom to live in peace. Amina Khattak watched the Americans disappear into the valley below, then turned toward her village. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to the way of life she had sworn to protect. But today, she had struck a blow for freedom that would echo through these ancient peaks for generations to come. The mountains had once again proven that they belonged to those who loved them most, not those who sought to conquer them. In the growing twilight, she began the long journey home, carrying her father's rifle and the knowledge that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. The guardian angel of the Hindu Kush had work to do, and the mountains would always need their protector. Freedom. 2 more obstacles between her mountains and peace. The hunt was almost over, but the most dangerous phase was just beginning. The surviving enemy fighters would now be expecting her, watching for her approach, ready to kill the ghost who had haunted them throughout the day. Amina picked up the dead sniper's rifle and checked its condition. The weapon was a precision instrument, far superior to the ancient rifle she had inherited from her father. If she was going to face professional killers on equal terms, she would need every advantage she could get. The war for these mountains had been fought with many different weapons over the centuries: swords and muskets, rifles and rockets, courage and determination. Today it would be decided by a woman with a knife and borrowed rifle, fighting to protect strangers because it was the right thing to do. The final phase of the hunt was about to begin. Guardian Angel. Morrison thought about the phrase and decided it fit. Someone was systematically eliminating the threats that kept them trapped, moving through terrain that should have been impassable, striking without sound or detection. If not an angel, then something close to it. The radio chatter from the remaining enemy positions was becoming increasingly frantic. Morrison could hear the fear in their voices even without understanding their words. These fighters had entered the day confident in their tactical superiority, and now they were facing something they couldn't understand or counter. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the valley, Morrison felt the balance of power shifting. 7 enemy snipers had become 4, then 3. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and their mysterious protector showed no signs of stopping. But 3 professional snipers could still kill them all if they made a mistake. Morrison knew they had to remain patient and let their invisible ally continue the deadly work of leveling the odds. Somewhere up in those ancient peaks, a guardian angel in black fabric was stalking through terrain that had witnessed countless battles across the centuries. The mountains had seen many armies come and go, but today they were witnessing something special. A lone warrior who moved like smoke and struck like lightning, defending strangers because it was the right thing to do. The enemy snipers had wanted to create a killing ground in these sacred mountains. Instead, they had encountered something far more dangerous than American Special Operations Forces. They had encountered the mountains themselves, given human form and deadly purpose. Eliminating him would disrupt enemy communications and possibly throw their entire plan into chaos. But it would also alert the remaining snipers that something was wrong. The element of surprise that had allowed her to eliminate the first 2 fighters would be lost. Amina made her decision. She would take the risk to remove their coordinator, even if it meant facing more difficult challenges with the remaining positions. Sometimes the most important target was also the most dangerous to attack. She dropped silently onto the rocks behind him, her feet finding purchase without disturbing a single loose stone. The sniper continued his radio conversation, reporting that the Americans remained pinned down and that his men were maintaining their positions. Those would be his last words. The knife stroke was precise and final. As the sniper collapsed, Amina quickly grabbed his radio headset and listened to the chatter from the remaining positions. The other fighters were asking for status reports, growing increasingly concerned about the lack of response from their coordinator. Within minutes, they would realize that something had gone terribly wrong with their ambush. The remaining 4 snipers would become more alert, more cautious, and infinitely more dangerous. But Amina was patient. She had learned long ago that the mountains rewarded patience and punished haste. The Americans below were safe for now, and she still had work to do. For enemy fighters remained between the trapped soldiers and their freedom. For more obstacles between her homeland and peace. The hunt would continue. Morrison continued to watch the area where the mysterious figure had disappeared. The silence from that position stretched into minutes. Other enemy snipers seemed to notice it too. Their rate of fire decreased as they apparently tried to establish communication with their missing comrade. "Sir," Thompson said quietly, "I think we just witnessed something extraordinary." Morrison lowered his binoculars and looked at his men. Each face reflected the same mixture of hope and disbelief. In the mountains of Afghanistan, miracles were rare commodities. But sometimes, when death seemed certain and options had run out, The impossible had a way of becoming possible. The figure they had seen was already moving toward the next position, flowing across the mountainside like water, finding its way downhill. Morrison realized that their salvation might not come from headquarters or air support. It might come from a ghost in black fabric who seemed to know these mountains better than the wind itself. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting longer shadows across the valley, Morrison felt the first stirring of hope he had experienced since the ambush began. Someone was out there, someone with skills that defied explanation, someone who might just level the playing field. The war in Afghanistan had taught him that allies could come from the most unexpected places. Today, it seemed, was about to provide another lesson in the unpredictability of combat. The enemy had 7 snipers positioned to kill them all. But now, something was hunting the hunters.